Welcome to episode 7 of Coastal Insights, which is our online programming where we're really trying to connect youth to conservation issues, ecology, and culture in the coast of British Columbia. So this is episode 7, and so for those of you who this is your first episode, we've in the past six episodes, we've been really exploring all different aspects of life on the BC coast. We've been introducing all kinds of different professionals and researchers who are working within these different fields of stewardship, conservation, science, and each week we're exploring different topics. And now this week's episode is going to be a really great one. We've got two folks here who've really, had a really big impact in my life, and both have been mentors to me. So today we are joined by Dr. Darimont and Jess Housty of the Heiltsuk Nation. So Dr. Darimont is a researcher and a biologist who works with Raincoast. He's been working with Raincoast for over 20 years, and he's now the director of science. So he is a professor at the University of Victoria, and he is the advisor for most of the students that we've had present in previous episodes. And then Jess Housty. Jess Housty is a community organizer in Bella Bella. And today we're going to be learning about how their two worlds come together. So with a whole bunch of new people involved this week, I just want to say just a few things before we dive fully in. So we're going to be taking questions. We're going to take most of our questions at the end. You can write those in the Q&A box, or you can do it in the chat. If there's anything that comes up during the presentation that you would like to bring to our attention, you can write that in the chat box. But please just remember to keep it respectful and keep it on topic. It can be a little bit distracting if we have all kinds of random comments coming in there. But without further ado, I'm going to shut myself off here, and we are going to proceed with our feature presentation today. So thank you guys for joining us. Just before I move on, just have to mention here that I am broadcasting today from the traditional unceded territory of the Cox First Nation. Thank you guys, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me join you today. It's a real honor to be speaking to you from my home in Heiltsuk territory in Bella Bella. My Heiltsuk name is Chuwagilo. My English name is Jess Housty. I do a bunch of stuff. When I was talking to Nate about how I would like to be introduced, I told him Jess Housty, she does some stuff. My official job is that I am the executive director of Cox Projects Society, which is a Heiltsuk-led charitable nonprofit in Bella Bella that's been running land-based healing and education programs for youth and families for the last 22 years. I grew up in the organization, cut my teeth doing communications and fundraising for Cox, and recently was promoted to executive director earlier this year. In addition to that, I am an active tribal counselor. I'm an elected counselor with Heiltsuk Tribal Council right now. I chair the land stewardship portfolio, which means that I get to be a champion for land-based governance for the nation and support the really amazing stewardship work that's done by our community. I wanted to show you some pictures that I think demonstrate some of the connections that really make me who I am. In the top row, you can see my late grandfather, George. In the middle, my grandmother, Peggy. And holding up the salmon is my late adopted grandfather, Ed. I'm really fortunate that I was able to be raised in my community and out on the land in a context where I could do a lot of intergenerational learning and growth. I had grandparents who were very active in my upbringing and taught me a lot about how my identity is tied to my territory and what my responsibilities are as a Heiltsuk person to steward and care for the places that nourish me. So that's been a really formative part of my life, is what I've been able to learn from my grandparents, my elders, and other community members and knowledge holders in Bella Bella. In the bottom, those are my two boys, Noah and Magnus. So I'm a mama to two little ones who keep me extremely busy, and for me really bring the work that I do into a much clearer focus, because it's one thing to do your work based on your values and the things that you hold really dear, but it just really makes it feel more real when you know that you're fighting for a better world for the beautiful little people that you brought into the world. So I feel really privileged to be mama to those two very wild little boys. I spend a lot of time in boardrooms and in meetings and on boards and in council meetings, wearing business clothes and being super awkward. But what I'm actually most passionate about is just being outside, usually covered in dirt, surrounded by plants, just out on the territory. I feel really fortunate that I get to live in the heart of my homeland and spend a lot of time out on the land, some of which I've spent out on the land with Chris, and I'm really excited to be sharing some stories from the time that we've spent together in Heiltsuk territory.
Thank you so much, Jess. Likewise, it's nice to see you, however far away you may be, but you are nonetheless close to me. Nate, thank you also for this wonderful opportunity to share some time together. And it's wonderful to see the vast array of people that have tuned in from far and wide. I'm broadcasting from Lekwungen territories, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, the Wasanich peoples that have neither ceded their territories nor their knowledge about living within their lands and on their oceans for many millennia. So with that context, I begin. As Nate mentioned, I'm a scientist and have been for most of my adult life, and he wanted to encourage me to share with you how I became the scientist I am, how have opportunities presented themselves or how I had sought them out. And I could share with you these sort of familiar stories about a privileged upbringing, which I no doubt had with my parents investing in me and my education, in my experiences in nature. That was clearly important. Also important was working very hard at school, in high school. My understanding is many of whom that are watching today are in high school, but also working hard in university, applying myself, digging deep to accomplish all the steps on the way to becoming a practical scientist. But I want to share with you something different, and that is what was the special sauce, so to speak, in my life and in my development. And that was seeking out, recognizing, and developing a purpose, how I would come to apply my privilege or any expertise or scientific knowledge or tools or resources towards some sort of greater good, towards the good of both human communities and ecological communities. And that's very much is a purpose for me. And when times are tough or research is difficult, it's that sense of purpose that keeps me going. And I want you to consider that as you know, some high school exams or coursework seems particularly challenging. Think about what you're aiming towards contributing to a broader good. It's that will get you through anything, in my view. My purpose started to crystallize and become evident not long after I arrived in Bella Bella in Heiltsuk territory and was hosted by Jess and her family some 20 years ago, and welcomed really graciously by all members of the Heiltsuk community, from the young ones at a camp that Jess will tell you about very shortly, to elders and everyone in between. At that time, 20 years ago, there was, and there still remains, great concern over forestry gone rampant. It was a time at which the Heiltsuk, their territory was being logged at very high rates, and the Heiltsuk were gaining, establishing their authority to manage those forests before, and It was those motivations and goals and the value systems that underlied their ambitions for resurgence that really drew me into becoming a scientist that wanted to do work in service of that community and for the larger ecological community. So that's a little bit about me and what makes me tick. I wanted to start very briefly with a story. And it's a story that I think of when I'm asked to talk about Indigenous knowledge. I want to be very clear from the get-go that I'm not an Indigenous knowledge holder. I can never be one. And by the end of this webinar, you'll find out more why that is the case. But I've rather been interested in witnessing the Indigenous knowledge shared by others, and interested in how two knowledge sources, ways of knowing, both Western science and Indigenous knowledge can interact. So here's a story about Chester Starr, a Heiltsuk man now in his mid 60s. These pictures are 20 to 15 years old at a time when I first started to get to know Lone Wolf, as he is otherwise known, and worked with Chester. And it was on a May day, a day that looked like this, sunny and bright. And we were in the middle of that channel that you see on the right of your screen. It was the second or third day of our work together on coastal wolves. And I remember that day really well, not only because it was beautiful, we're in a beautiful place, but Chester, in a typical Heiltsuk way, had gifted me this beautiful t-shirt with wolves on it that he had picked up at the band store after our first day of work together. And he had given me that t-shirt, and I had put it on actually, and we were on anchor eating our lunch, and he asked me the most peculiar at that time question, and it was, what wolves are we here to study? Are we here to study timber wolves? As you look to the east, to your right on the screen, that mountainous mainland chunk, or are we going to study the island wolves? And you look to the west, or to your screen's left, to the flatter island environment. I said, what do you mean, Chester? Isn't there one wolf here? And he said, no, our people know of two wolves, two distinctly different types of wolves that inhabit our territory. And at that time, I didn't know enough to know how much I didn't know. I'll let you digest that. I did not know enough to know what I did not know coming into a territory like this, a landscape like this, trained only as a Western scientist. Because in my mind, there could not possibly be two different types of wolves in that environment. And nonetheless, we followed up on Chester's knowledge, applying some tools of science to understand this stark differentiation between wolf types that Chester had shared with us. And this sort of pattern has repeated itself again and again in the last 20 years, that when scientists turn their attention to patterns that Indigenous peoples have known and shared for many years, we find complementary information. We find the very same patterns. We may use different tools, in this case, behavioral observations and genetics and genomics procedures, but at the end of the day, what Chester's story was about those wolves and what the science story about those wolves were absolutely consistent. There is no hierarchy of knowledge. We didn't need to do this science to affirm what Chester had said. And the fact is that what we learn from merging these two ways of knowledge gives us a richer and broader perspective on animals like this. These are images of these island wolves, these coastal wolves, as Chester had predicted would be highly, highly marine oriented, making most of their living from marine resources, living like marine mammals, so to speak, swimming among islands in their territory. With that is the conclusion of a first little story, and I want to hand it back to Jess.
Thanks, Chris. I don't know if you can hear the rain on my roof. It's raining so hard that I can hardly hear Chris talking, and I had to turn up the volume. So I want to share a little bit about the Quay Camp program. I mentioned when I was introducing myself, my role with Cox Projects and the land-based programming that we do. Just a little bit more about the work that we do in a watershed south of Bella Bella called Quay. So in the late 1990s, there was a really strong sentiment expressed by hereditary chiefs in Bella Bella that we needed to create opportunities for young people and for their families to be out on the land so that they could start to build a stronger sense of identity as Heiltsuk people and understand how that identity was tied to the territory. You've probably learned a little bit about this in school or in conversations with your family. At least I hope that you've learned about it in school, but you know, we're a community that remains deeply impacted by the legacy of residential schools in the 60s scoop and lots of challenging pieces of colonial history that have left ripple effects through generations in the community. And there's been a lot of intergenerational trauma that we've really struggled to find positive ways to work through. And the really strong feeling from our hereditary chiefs and from our matriarchs was that the solution to wellness and to strength and to rebuilding who we are as Heiltsuk people was creating opportunities to be out on the land and be stronger in our cultural identities. And so when we started Quay Camp in 1999, that was our main goal, was to create a safe space for young people out on the land where they could learn about their natural environment, where they could learn about their culture and language, and also learn about some of the tools that exist that can help them to protect the places that they care about. And we've always had this sort of long-term goal that if young people care really deeply about the lands and waters in their territory, they're going to feel a really strong urge to stand up for it and protect it. And so we knew that investing in capacity building for young people, building up their identity connected to the land, that was going to be a really important long-term investment in stewardship for our community. We were going to raise generations of kids who cared really deeply about their territory. So that's some of the work that we've been doing over the last 22 years. And we've done it with support from lots of really key partners and knowledge holders. And Chris has talked a little bit already about the ways that Indigenous knowledge and Western science sometimes align really beautifully. And that's been a piece that we've always really enjoyed exploring through Quay Camp. So we bring groups of young people out on the land. We bring them out with elders and knowledge keepers who can be teaching them songs and dances and stories and ceremony and Heiltsuk language, and helping them to see through a cultural lens how they're connected to the species and resources and places around camp. We've often also invited outside resource people, like Chris, for example, who can help those young people to see the territory through a different lens, through a scientific lens as well, because we've always really firmly believed that science can be a really important tool for us to protect the places we care about. And so, for example, if we're having a grizzly bear camp, we might bring out 20 kids and a group of knowledge holders from inside and outside the community who will teach the kids origin stories about grizzly bears and language related to grizzly bears and songs and dances that they learn in the big house related to grizzly bears. But we might also have a scientist like Chris who will talk about bear behavior and bear ecology and bear conservation, so that coming out the other side of camp, we have kids who have had the opportunity to look at a species or a resource or a system from lots of different vantage points. And for us, being able to really encourage young people to be curious and to look deep into the things that are around them, that's been a really key part, I think, of what makes the programs out on the land so powerful, is you start to understand the things around you on multiple different levels, and to just really awaken this passion and curiosity that comes from knowing a little bit and wanting to know more. And that's a sentiment that I think has, echoed not only through the land-based programs that we run at Cox, but also a lot of the partnerships that we've explored over the years with researchers and scientists, and in the context of the field school that we're going to talk about a little bit later.
being in the territory and at places like the Quay, we've learned is also about relationships with and responsibilities to people. So we've learned this as scientists, even participating at these Quay camps. It's not just the campers that are learning about science and culture, it's also us as resource people who are learning arguably more up in the territory than we could ever learn in academia. And one lesson that we hear again and again is the need and value in considering how any scientific research can be done in service of people. How can the relationships that we can cultivate and maintain over time lead to great things, lead to new insight among young people, or inform and empower decision-making by local Indigenous knowledge holders and governments. And so it's with this underlying value in mind that centers relationships. Our Raincoast lab at the University of Victoria was formed, and the work of Raincoast programs throughout this territory and more was formed, the bedrock of how science is conducted. So whereas in high school and at university, you may learn about some tools to approach science with, very rarely, if ever, can you learn appropriate ways in which science should and ought to be conducted in the real world, in the context of Indigenous resurgence, in the context of the legacy and very much presence of how science can and does, if scientists are not careful, impose harm on Indigenous peoples. So it's these lessons we learned at Quay and in other special places with special people like Jess and her family and knowledge holders that guides our work as both scientists and, as we're about to share, as educators. So I'll just speak for a quick minute here about a course that many of you might aim for in your near future. And this is a fabulous course that Jess and I teach, which is a partnership between Cox Projects Society and UVic. It's a fourth year UVic geography class that we title casually the University of Quay. Because in a very real sense, this incredible natural and cultural landscape becomes a classroom for up to 20 university students each year. And we bring to this class both this responsibility to provide service to our students and the communities with which this class interacts, and a rich experience for those students. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jess to tell you more about this course.
Yeah, so I really love this course because it's so different from the university experience that I had when I was at UVic as an undergraduate student. And for decades, we've seen graduate students and researchers who come into the territory to do research and get their degrees and publish their papers and their dissertations, often on subjects that are not of any real relevance or benefit to the community. And at the same time, as a community and as a nation, Heiltsuk is working so hard to build its stewardship capacity and ability to take good, strong care of the lands and waters and very informed decision making. And it seemed like there was a really big gap there, that there were a lot of people coming into the community, conducting studies and gathering data, but it wasn't necessarily aligned with the data gaps that the nation had identified or the stewardship needs that were emerging for Heiltsuk. So a lot of work has been done in recent years to try to bring that into more alignment and to ensure that people who are coming into the territory wanting to conduct research as part of their graduate studies have an opportunity to learn about what the stewardship priorities are for Heiltsuk and how they can design academically rigorous work that is also of service to community. And so when Chris and I were exploring the idea of developing a field school, we wanted to make sure that we were modeling all of the amazing things that we learned through things like Quake Camp and Chris's own research here and my work both at Cox and at Heiltsuk Tribal Council. And what emerged was this field school where we bring students in to the community. They start their field school in Bella Bella, where they get to interact with elders and knowledge holders who can place the work of the class in a really important social and historical context that really helps people to understand who we are as a community and where we are today. The students have an opportunity to interact with managers at our stewardship office to learn about what the greatest needs are in community, what the issues are that we're seeing out on the lands and waters, and how students can potentially help to fill information gaps and support stronger applied stewardship by Heiltsuk through the work that they do. And once the students have had some time in Bella Bella to really sink into that deep community learning, that's when they go out to Quay and get to spend some time out on the land in the same place that we run the Quay camp for kids, but at a different time of year. And throughout the course of the class, you know, we're able to bring community knowledge holders down to join us out on the land and help to support that really amazing, deep experiential learning out on the land that is ensuring that the instruction for the class is coming not just through scientific perspectives from Chris and other researchers who join us, but also from the elders and knowledge keepers who are able to be out there with us and bring a really strong cultural lens to what we're doing. And throughout that class, and I'll let Chris talk about this in more detail, we've designed a series of assignments that are really focused on building on what students have learned in community and doing work that is of service to community.
Much of our class time, as Nate actually we see in the foreground might be able to corroborate as our first alum of the course, it's very much hands-on. Here's a magical picture for me that took place, I think, in the very first year we taught this course together in 2013. What we're doing is very much hands-on. We see people, Jess included, digging with our bare hands into what's called a clam garden. And this was and is a form of mariculture or aquaculture, so to speak, in which Indigenous peoples, including the Heiltsuk, have and had operated for thousands of years to increase the productivity of clam beds, to potentially keep out other predators of clams like sea otters. And it represents an enduring example of sustainable resource use over time. So not only was this exercise in particular very hands-on, but it set in motion some really valuable conversations we want to spark here. And that is understanding that at times Indigenous knowledge and science very much align, but at times there's some divergence. And what I want to speak to here is that whereas there is a history of scientific resource management that in the last 100 or 200 years has led to what we refer to as serial depletion of resources, despite some of the world's finest scientific minds being applied to resource management, especially aquaculture and fisheries. What we've seen under what we call centralized, top-down colonial resource management, managers in Ottawa dictating, for example, how a cod fishery on the East Coast or a salmon fishery on the West Coast should operate, has by and large had a miserable track record. We can paint a stark contrast with this hands-on work that gives us very direct, tangible record of people's place-based societies with highly what we call decentralized management, in which Heiltsuk people manage Heiltsuk resources. And the archaeological record in this case, in the case of clam gardens or herring management or salmon management, you name it, shows a very different pattern. Instead of serial depletion, we see almost universally a pattern of sustainable resource use over time. So it's this combination of very hands-on work that leads us to some conversations about where science can go wrong and where the values and the knowledge underlying traditional and indigenous ways of land and marine resource management can provide guidance into the future and beyond. So that's a big part of our course. Pass it back to Jess.
I'm not sure if you can hear or see me. I'm getting a note that my internet connection is unstable. Yeah, so I have had just the profound fortune of being able to grow up in a place as magical as Quay and be part of running programs that have, grown and evolved so much over the course of, the 20 odd years that we've been down there. But really, when you take the longer view, there's archaeological evidence, and we know from our oral history that Heiltsuk people have lived in this space and cared for this space for over 10,000 years. And so when you think about the blip of time that we're in right now in the spectrum of that long human history there, it feels very small. But it's so magical to be able to take the kind of learning that we strive for in the class outside of a classroom context and out on the land. And, I would venture to say that the greatest teacher in this class is the land itself, and certainly not myself and probably not Chris, but the land that we're able to learn from. And I think that's a sense of connection that is built really strongly in the students who participate in the class. We've had the fortune of having a bunch of really amazing Heiltsuk and other Indigenous students who participated in the class over the years. We've done it, 5 or 6 times now? And every year it's just such an amazing dynamic of people who are building a sense of community in that space and thinking about research as something that is very community oriented and very applied and has a real intense sense of magic to it because of where we are and how we're learning together. And so when you look at the kinds of projects and assignments that emerge from the class, it's just phenomenal how tied they are to the needs of that place, the stewardship needs of the community, how responsive they are to the real applied situations that students get to experience in the course of the class. Chris, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the projects that we've had over the years. I know you have some slides about Tommy Trail.
You bet, I sure will. En route to one of those slides, I just want to pick up on 2 things that you said, Jess, that were really important. One, landscape as teacher, we basically follow the cues from the landscape to these wonderful opportunities to learn, and that's very much what I've can gather a Heiltsuk way of learning and of experiencing and receiving and new knowledge. The second thing I want to point out en route to a slide about particular assignments is noting that whereas I referred to the archaeological record for evidence of sustainability, you very rightly pointed out the relevance and the prominence of oral history in telling stories of sustainability over time. And it's that exact interaction, whereas my bias went to scientific evidence, you reminded our listeners quite rightly that oral history is a legitimate and a very important source of knowledge to understand how things were and how things are and how things could be in the context of resource management. So I'm going to go to a slide here that discusses and gives an example of one of the major projects that some students embarked on. And again, it's this idea that we have a responsibility as educators and the students in that class, some of whom may come from Bella Bella or nearby communities, have a responsibility back to those communities who have opened up their territories, and in some cases their homes, for these students that come up for a couple weeks each year. So it's very much teaching and learning intersecting with community service. And here's a fantastic example that I think maybe I'll pass it back to you, Jess, to explain the relevance of, because it relates directly back to Quay and Quay Camp.
Yeah, so this project emerged in the minds of some students who'd really listened to community members and, particularly some of the staff at Cox who'd talked about needs around tsunami and emergency preparedness. So Quay is located on the mainland, but just facing Hakai Pass, which is a big open passageway to open ocean. So you can see in the picture on the cover of this report that, Quay's got a big, beautiful sandy beach that's essentially facing onto open ocean. And we've identified it over the years as being, a risk in the case of a tsunami, and it's a place where we often have substantial groups of youth and families out on the land there. And so we wanted to make sure that we were developing a safety plan that addressed tsunami risk in Quay, but that wasn't something that we had a lot of in-house expertise on. We did, however, have some students in the class who were really passionate about mapping and sort of physical geography, and that was a piece that they felt really strongly they could take on. And so using GIS and scientific tools, but also very informed by Heiltsuk oral history around tsunamis and knowledge of the needs in that particular place, they developed this really neat project where they not only mapped what the best tsunami evacuation route would be, but they actually cleared the trail. And this is a project that has evolved over different cohorts of the class because, students in subsequent classes picked up where this project left off and actually enhanced the trails that had been built by the first group and added new trails and layered Heiltsuk stories and Heiltsuk oral history and Heiltsuk knowledge over this sort of physical geography emergency response component. And so what we have at the end of the day is trails where my staff can take groups of Heiltsuk kids out on tsunami evacuation trails, familiarize them with those evacuation routes, but really normalize using them, teach them medicinal and edible plants along the way, give them a strong sense of comfort and security that will really benefit them if we ever face an emergency like this in Quay. The kids are going to know exactly where the evacuation route is and what resources along the way can help them. And so this was one example of a really neat project that uses scientific tools to meet really clearly identified community needs.
And I'll just follow up with by sharing ever so briefly another example of the type of activity that our students at Quay engage in towards some sort of community service. So, and I'll conclude with that part and tell you at the beginning, this what we call digital harvest guide was this opportunity for students not to be in a classroom setting or even a setting with the whole class, but rather in small groups or pairs, go out and interact with the landscape. And whereas we would not dare actually harvest plants and animals as students there, especially as outsider students, wouldn't harvest them with nets or so on, but we would instead harvest the photons. We would take photographs of plants and animals and sign that animals left behind, and put together what is often a visually stunning guidebook of 20 or 25 species or life forms or relationships that students would encounter and learn about and spend time with at the Quay, and merge it into this guidebook that, and here's the key, that would then become useful and in service of Quay campers. Some students, for example, made treasure hunt activities where campers who would be coming down to the Quay in the next month or two would have to find 25 different clues from the environment that would lead them to their own opportunities to engage with plants and animals, the territory. And here's just one example of something that Stephen Hall, someone who refers to himself as an urban Heiltsuk, grew up in Vancouver and is an alum of our course last year. His revolved around wildlife in Quay, and that's the alternative spelling for Quay, the Heiltsuk spelling of Quay. And here's one beautiful page from that digital harvest guide in which Stephen beautifully matched this picture of an abalone shell with some gorgeous earrings that were made from abalone. So mixing a couple of Stephen's interests here in art and beauty with natural histories. Not only did Stephen spend time with this important wildlife or marine species, but also thought about its various uses and packaged up this information in a really beautiful and compelling way, so that his guide would become a teaching tool in itself for the younger generation of campers that would soon see the shores of the Quay. So there's a nice example of that intersection of local values, community service, some natural history, and more. So with that, I think we're going to end with just some fun photos to remind everyone, at least before a question period, to also have fun out there. This is Jess and I having great fun together, I think, during our first year of teaching together. And there's a picture of our host, Nathaniel, having some fun in his time as a student in the course. So with that, I think Jess and I will hand it back to Nathaniel, and we will stand by for some questions.
All right, thank you so much, you guys. That's a pretty neat slide to finish up on there, because I come from a unique position in that I've both been a student of yours at Quay, and I've also got to be an educator at Quay, and to get to see the receiving and the providing experience that you guys have created there. It really is a game changer. It completely changed my perspective on so many different things in my life. So thank you guys very, very much for what you're doing and being here today. In the theme of giving thanks, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of the sponsors that have allowed us to do not just this program, but all of the really amazing environmental education programs we've been providing for youth. So this time of year, we would typically be with youth out on the sailboat and out and exploring the territories, and instead this is what we're doing instead. So to follow Jess and learn more about the Cox Projects Society, here's a little bit of info how to find them. There's all kinds of amazing programs that they have going on there, and it really is a really unique setup, and they really fill in all the gaps where the community really has these needs and the government hasn't provided. It's really neat to see an organization like that really take up so many different
Did Nate disappear?
Oh, we may have lost Nate for a while here. That's okay. maybe I'll cruise the chat for, oh, Marine's on to save the
I don't know
day.
what happened to Nate, but okay, I will, let's see. So we'll go into Q&A. And if anybody has questions, please feel free to type it into the chat or the Q&A box. So there's a question here for Jess. Jess, are you still running a library in Bella Bella and the current status?
Yeah, I am. So, I talked about the land-based programs that Cox runs, but we also do in-community programming, including a library that we've been operating since 2007 and a gardening program in Bella Bella. Our model as an organization is we try to step up and fill gaps when the community identifies them, and one of the gaps that was identified was a community library. So over the last 13 years, that is a project that we've been working on. We lost our original library to a fire, unfortunately, in 2013, but we built. And I'm actually speaking from my office at the end of the library, so it's still alive and well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Nate's back. Okay, I'm just going to pass it back to Nate.
So I kind of wanted to pose a question to you guys, and I was thinking about this one the whole time while I was getting to enjoy the presentation. The question period is really a really good opportunity to really target what you think is the most important things that youth and young people can get out of these programs. So I was wondering if I could get each of you, so there's one question for each of you. So for Chris, what advice would you give to a young scientist who wants to engage in this landscape and do so respectfully under the guidance of communities? So what sort of snippet of advice would you have for that? And then for you, Jess, how about for young Indigenous leaders who want to take that next step in terms of getting involved in these kinds of community programs? So we don't have too much time for questions, so I'd really like for you guys to each kind of give us your piece on those.
Since you asked me first, I'll go ever so briefly, and that is to remind people that we are born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that it's a really good rule of thumb to use them in that ratio. So it's been really important to me to listen, to first and foremost understand and respect the sovereignty of the Heiltsuk and other nations in whose territory we work. And I think those two things alone sets in motion a very different way of doing research than most scientists are trained to embark on. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jess.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess my feedback would be that when I think about my personal experience as a young Indigenous woman, growing up, getting through high school, getting through an undergraduate degree, I always really struggled with the feeling that my education was something that was boxed into a classroom, and that so much of the messaging that I heard, particularly around science and knowledge systems, really privileged Western ways of thinking over Indigenous ways of thinking, which really made me feel erased in academia, if I'm being honest, and really made me struggle really heavily with getting through to the end of my educational path. But I've been really fortunate through my life experience after school to really feel affirmed in the idea that we're still here as Indigenous people. Our knowledge systems have been through so much, but in many beautiful ways, they're still so strong and so intact. And part of my personal journey to sort of come into my own in the work that I do has been to really let myself take up space as an Indigenous person, to feel strong in my cultural identity, to assert that learning can happen out on the land, that the land can be a teacher, that the classroom doesn't have to be a physical room, but that you can take learning out, have it happen in intergenerational ways through multiple knowledge systems. And as we've shared about Quay Camp and Chris's research and the field school, I really hope that those can stand as examples for all of you, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that there's more than one way to do things, and that many ways of doing things are valid, and sometimes they align, sometimes they don't align, but they're all worth exploring. And I think the curiosity and sense of personal power that you have when it comes to your educational path and your development as a young person, let yourself feel strong in that. And yeah, just know that there's many paths forward, and that learning can happen in so many ways, and take you to really beautiful places.
I think it's really important to sort of on that note to say that like these programs that we're doing and all the different boat-based programming and stuff that we do at Raincoast, we do because of the guidance that Qqs and Camp has given us. There was a few questions that were kind of a little bit more like logistical questions. We had a question about, is it possible to join the geography program even if you're not a university student? So no, this is an upper level university class that is sort of held in priority for students at the top of their degree when they're finishing, and they're really looking for that. Oh, Chris has a comment here.
That's true in the sense that when we consider the pool of applicants within UVic, for example, we emphasize upper level enrollment, fourth year students in particular, but Jess and I, it's actually a condition by which we both teach those classes that we reserve as many spots as possible as requested for people from the Heiltsuk community or neighboring communities to participate. And it's really actually one of the strengths of the course too, because we get this incredible interaction of learners together that bring with them, in some cases, some of the experiences that Jess has had with her elders, these students have had with elders in their communities, in Bella Bella and beyond. So we emphasize enrollment from both local communities and upper level in geography at UVic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. There was also questions about, so yes, that's the answer to that one. And then for Camp itself, Jess, there was a question about what age, who is actually going to Camp?
Yeah, so generally campers are between 8 and 15 years old, and the vast majority of them are Heiltsuk, not exclusively Heiltsuk, but it is, of course, challenging and expensive to get all the way to Bella Bella if you don't live in the area. Generally, we run 6 camps a year, and we bring between 20 and 25 kids per camp out on the land for 5 days. So yeah, they're generally young Heiltsuk people.
Great. And now we have a question from Phillip Charles. So I'm guessing this is Phillip, who's probably back in the UK. This seems like a pretty guided and well-researched question here. So what are the current community-generated research questions, and also those moving forward? And he says just a big thank you for the talk. So current projects that are really integrating with the community.
So I would say it's a little bit of a challenging question to answer this year, because unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we were not able to operate the 2020 field school as planned. But one really great example from last year that I would share is something that was really responsive to community needs, is that if you were on the coast or even on social media, you probably know that after the weather conditions and weather patterns last winter, there was a massive die-off of salal all up and down the coast. And it was something that people really were alarmed by here, because it's a food species that we depend on and that other animals depend on, and we'd just seen this huge drastic die-off of salal bushes everywhere, and no one really seemed to know why. And hearing that concern and that alarm when they were interacting with community before we went out to Quay, we had actually 2 groups of students who tackled that question from different angles and tried to reason through what some of the causes might be and what might be options for helping to rehabilitate salal, if that was even possible. And so I think that's just a really neat example of how students find ways to answer the questions they hear when they're in community.
Great. Okay, what else do we have for questions? We got a couple moments left, and we'll maybe take one more here. So, okay, so Jess, you've talked a lot about the youth programs and the different community initiatives, but an important part of what Qqs does, and sort of a side of things that I've been able to be a part of, is the research. And so what is your strategy for work within Qqs? How do you go about partnering with researchers?
So the research piece is not actually something that we do through Qqs at this point in time. Actually, for a long time before the nation had its own stewardship office, Qqs did do scientific research and monitoring on behalf of the nation to help ensure that there was, informed decision-making happening here. But in 2010, our nation established its own stewardship office, and this is actually the first year that we've transitioned all of our research programs over to be administered by the stewardship office, which I think is a really amazing milestone in terms of the level of capacity the nation has developed to be able to do its own research and monitoring work. But the work they do is very much informed by what community members see when they're out on the lands and waters. It's very focused on the species and resources that we have strong kinship and relationships with. And so a lot of it's focused on the Guardian Watchman program, getting eyes and ears out on the land and water. It's focused on salmon and herring research, climate change impacts throughout our territory, and yeah, just very responsive to the things that we're seeing ourselves out on the land.
Wow, that's really amazing. So I'm seeing our chat box is now being filled with gratitude. So I think that's a perfect segue just to say a huge thank you to both of you for joining us today, but not only that, for providing these really incredible, life-changing educational experiences that myself and others are now getting to do ourselves, and we wouldn't be doing that if it weren't for the experiences that we got to have by connecting with places like Quay and learning from elders and learning these ways to operate in collaboration and do everything as respectful as possible. So thank you guys very much for being here today. A big thank you to Maureen Vo for getting all of this together weekly. Next week's episode is we're going to be talking about killer whales on the coast of BC. So a bit of a shift of gears here, but yet another very important coastal topic. So from Raincoast, thank you guys very much, and thank all of you for joining us here today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Jess. Thanks, Marina.